Hey everybody, how you all doing? Welcome back to another session of Howard University, and today is really special. Well, they're all special because I just enjoy the time I get with Dr. Fuller. But we get to talk about his book, and in return, he wanted to talk about mine, which I'm honored by. But Dr. Fuller, how you doing, man? How was your week?
Hey, Charles, I'm doing okay, man. But like any Black person, right? I go back to this time after time. If you read this book called Black Rage, and there's a quote in there, I think it's by James Baldwin, who said that any Black person who is relatively conscious ought to be in a constant state of rage. And that was even before everything that's happening. I mean, my life has been like a constant state of rage. And so as I listen to what's going on today, I'm just getting more and more enraged. So if I could just take a moment before we get into the book to talk about this, because I want your reflection and reaction to it. So here's where I'm at. So earlier in the late last week, I was talking to some younger people, and I made a mistake in the way I was thinking, because they were talking about defunding the police, and I was saying, man, I don't know if that's like a demand that's possible, right? But the more I stepped back and thought about it, that is exactly the demand that needs to be made. Now, we can get into the definition of what defunding the police means, but what I'm trying to get at, Charles, is like, if you listen to the arguments of the police union, it's the same arguments of the teachers union. Because what it is you have two broken systems that do not work for our children and for our community. But what happens is when you begin to talk about changing it, you can't really talk about radical change if you're not willing to engage in radical change. And these institutions have proven not to work. The educational institutions destroy our children's mind. The police institution kills us. So I kept thinking to myself, okay, Howard, you make arguments over the years that the public school system, the way that it was structured, is fundamentally incapable of educating large numbers of our children. Well, if you look at the police department, it is fundamentally incapable of providing justice. And what happens is, Charles, we need to talk about this at some point in time, man. Like, if you say, well, how did the American education system get started? It started because Horace Mann went over to Prussia. And so that the structure as it is set up was based on how it was set up in Prussia. And over the years, that system has been protected and protected and protected. If you go back and look at police, I remember reading years ago, and I pulled it up today, a book called Iron Fists and Velvet Gloves. And it's an interesting book because it delves into how did the police start. See, one of the problems we always have when we start talking about changing a structure, we always get caught because we believe, well, this has always existed. No, it didn't always exist. At some point, it had to get started. And the question was, what was the philosophical foundations of how it started? And so if you go back and look at how the police start, for some people, they like to talk about the day and night police that started in New York in 1845. And this allows you to have an analysis that says, well, the police really started as a way to deal with increasing social problems and stuff like that. But in reality, the earliest form of the modern police force was the slave patrols. And so if you go back and look at like the slave patrols and what was the role of the slave patrols. And then if you go deeper, Charles, and you start understanding that a lot of the modern day police forces were initially controlled by the owners of companies. because as these companies developed, and they clearly wanted to oppress the workers, they had to get a armed force when people began to strike, when people began to do, breaking up the equipment. There were all kinds of things that happened. And so the point I'm trying to make is that instead of just poo-pooing the call to defund the police, what we should be doing is trying to say to those people who are raising that demand, we understand what you're saying, because just talking about professionalizing a group of people who are oppressing you, how does that change? Because our assumption is that the system itself is okay, but there's probably a few bad apples in it, or there are probably a few bad policies. There are probably a few bad practices. That's not how you radically change anything, man. You radically change something by going back and understanding its roots, its foundation. Where did it come from? What was the philosophy that was driving it? And if you're not willing to go back to that point, Charles, you can't radically change the system, man. It's not possible. And so I don't know, man. At some point in time, it's important that we support, people like me support the people who are out in the street, right? Because the other thing that happens, man, is you got younger people who are out in the street who are making demands. When it comes time for the change to occur, you bring in all the established Negroes, to talk about, what the change is going to look like. Mm-hmm. You don't bring in the people who are actually out in the street, right? Because we start talking about, well, certain people got to get around the table. My thing is, who needs to get around the table are the people who are creating the impetus for the table to exist at this moment in history. Because if you don't do that, we're going to keep perpetrating the same pacification strategies over and over again. I've been sending around an article that I can't remember who the dude wrote it, an Asian person, I think, who worked in foundations. And he was making the point that moderate foundations and moderate nonprofits are doing what Dr. King warned us against in Letter from the Birmingham jail, when he said that the problem that Black people have is not with the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council. The problem that they have is with moderate people, moderate white people, who are always saying, this is not the season, this is not the way to do it, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
And it all becomes a way to blunt radical change. And I just think at this moment in history, it's worth at least having that discussion, even if people disagree with me, which I understand. But it's worth talking about at some point in time, right? Because if we're gonna really, if this is an inflection point, Charles, what's gonna make this an inflection point? Mm-hmm. What does it mean? Because I keep hearing people say, oh, Howard, I understand what you're saying, man, but this is different because there's so many more white people out there. There's this, there's that, blah, 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 blah. And I keep saying to them, yeah, I hear y'all, but tell me why you think something different is going to happen. And if you do think something different is going to happen, what does it look like? Mm-hmm. What becomes something that we can say is different? So I just want to get that in, man, before we talk about the books.
No, I think I actually agree with you. I was on with a group of education leaders in the Bay Area, and I've been talking about this for a while. And I think that people are starting to take a deeper look into government and systemic issues with groups like the police union. And I think that what's going to happen is that we are seeing when you have one option of something and how people are treated. And if it's always the Black people and the poor people and the brown people, the ones that's being mistreated, that's being shot down, that's being done, in the way in which they've been done, people are now saying, well, we need to defund that. We need to make sure they don't get as much money and actually put that money somewhere else. I think this is the opportune time for educators to start asking the same questions. If every district is the Black kids that's got to be at the bottom, every district is the brown kids that get suspended the most all over the country. Like, if you say this a lot, and I have stolen it, with no shame. If it wasn't built by God, then it can be changed, right? And I think that this movement to defund police and the way that it's actually getting some traction, I think we're going to see it. And we haven't even started talking about healthcare. We haven't started talking about education. We haven't started talking about these other things. I think that this momentum can be rode to make sure that we are not opening back up with the same situation and structures that we had before the country shut down. This is the time that people should be looking long and hard at the schools that we make them go to, We threaten you with prison if you don't go to our schools. And I think that right now is going to be the time for change. I think people are going to ask for something different. So I think that you right on spot. I think that was the perfect analogy that you had. And I think that it actually fits right into the book. You have a book, No Struggle, No Progress. It has a much longer title. But I love that book. I remember when it came out, and I used to just bug you all the time about doing an audiobook. Like, you gotta do an audiobook. And I'm glad that actually happened. That book had a deep impact on me. It was it was like having a mentor right over your shoulder. And between that book and American Babylon, and I get to spend time with Elaine Brown. I spent some time, living in Oakland. You get to just see Black Panthers just having coffee, and they'll talk to you. But I think between when I read your book and then I had a meeting with her, and she was just very stern in her ways as well, it just did something for me in what type of leader I should be. So, like, what led you to write that book, man? What, at the moment when you wrote it, like, what finally got you to sit down and get all this stuff out your head?
Well, there were several things. First of all, right now, Charles, there's probably about 22 to 25 books where people talk about me in one way or another. Some of them a lot more, some of them just a mention, like Midnight Hour or A Long Way to Go or Best of Enemies, that got turned into that movie. Our Separate Ways, talking about the organization work I did of Black women down in North Carolina. So there's a lot of books out there, man, where people talk about me. And so I kept saying to myself, man, Howard, at some point, man, you need to tell your own story. Because everybody who's talking about you look at you through whatever frame they want to look at you. And they characterize you in whatever way they want to characterize you. Like More Than One Struggle, for example, which tells the struggle of Black people in Milwaukee to get an education for poor Black kids, right? And it uses 4 people as a way to talk about it. I'm one of those people. So the first thing was, man, okay, so there's all of this stuff out here. You need to sit down with somebody and try to tell your own story in your own words so you can get that out there. The second thing was, man, I saw it as a way to honor my mother and my grandmother, right? Because without my mother and my grandmother, I'm not here, man. The sacrifices that my mother and my grandmother made in order for me to be here talking to you today. And I wanted to tell a little bit of their story. Like my grandmother, for example, man. I tell this story about how I was sitting in Shreveport, Louisiana, where I was born, and I was sitting on the back steps. I forgot how young I was then, but me and my mother were sitting there, and these cops came by and said that there was some man in the house that had robbed somebody. And my mother said, well, there's nobody in the house. And the cop said, girl, I told you to move. And he kicked my mother. And so the people who lived in the back called my grandmother, who was at work. My grandmother came home, man, got her gun, and went to the police station looking for the cop that kicked her daughter. That's the blood that runs in my veins. So I wanted to, and just the sacrifices that my mother made, man, so that I could, ultimately go to college and all of this stuff.
Right.
So I wanted to honor them. The third thing was I tell a lot of stories in the book about a number of my friends and comrades in struggle who died. And so I felt like if I could tell my story, I could tell their story. Like I talk about a woman in the book named Thelma Jean Miller. We called her TJ. And TJ was the most fierce warrior of all of us, man. And I remember when TJ was on her deathbed, and I went by and I read the section of the book that talked about her. And TJ is the kind of person, if she didn't like it, she would cuss me out, even on her deathbed. But for her to say, I like it, it meant everything to me, man. The next reason, the fourth reason, man, was I wanted young people who would read the book and say that they want to fight for social justice. I wanted them to like understand that if you decide to fight for justice in this country for 5 minutes, you're going to live in a sea of contradictions. And so for me, it was the thing about, are you willing to live with those contradictions? For example, I've been called a revolutionary, a counter-revolutionary, a militant, Uncle Tom, a tool of billionaires. How does one lone Black man get to be all of that? And I think you get to be all of that, at least from my perspective, is because I ain't gonna allow nobody to define me. And I know that I've made decisions that people don't agree with, and I've been attacked for, and I knew I was gonna be attacked for. And so, you know, you and I have talked about this before, Charles. It's that interest convergence theory that I learned from Derek Bell. But what I'm trying to say to people is you can't fight for any modicum of justice out here and not at some point be involved in contradiction. And so the struggle to understand the difference between principle versus strategy and tactics. Mm-hmm. Right? And so what I was hoping is that by reading my book, people would get a sense of some of those struggles and some of the quote compromises you make along the way when you're trying to get something done, you know, for our people. And the question is, are you willing to take the weight, you know, for those decisions? And then the last thing is that it gave me a way, man, to put out there not just the positive things, but some of the negative stuff that I've done, and then to own up to all of it being what makes you who you are, right? And so, you know, that was sort of why I wrote the book. Those are the main reasons.
Well, like I said, man, that book means a lot to me. I have a few different copies, all of them signed, and you know, I have one that's all written and messed up because I done wrote all in it or whatnot, and one that don't have a crease in it. So I appreciate that, man. I know that you had wanted to cover some of my book, and I just wanted to, let me just say thank you, right? Because when you got the copy of my book, you like live tweeted it, and it was great. Like you had these reflections, man, and it, you know, it's almost like Huey P. Newton, like taking something that I wrote and like if he was around and putting it on Twitter, man. So that's huge for me. So thank you for that. You didn't have to do that.
Oh no. So you let me know when I get a chance to ask you questions. Are we gonna
go ahead? We can go back and forth. Go ahead.
Okay. So my first question is similar to your first question, and that is, why did you choose the topic that you chose for your dissertation?
Oh man, I chose it for a few reasons. One, man, I really did not enjoy my doctoral program, and for the reasons was I saw that it was just tailor-made for like white women, and it felt like it was just built as a Black and Brown 101. And just the stuff that we read, and it just I could see the savior complex being built up from what we was reading, and I just saw some of the other people's topics. And no disrespect, people, you know, dissertations are often very boring topics, but I wanted something that reflected me, and I wanted something that reflected us and didn't always have us as the problem. You know, I read a lot of books and they talk about the Negro problem, or it's in coded language, basically like, how do you go in and fix these people? And when that's the lens that you start out with, then, you know, I don't think the outcome is going to be very positive. So I wanted to I knew how I grew up. I knew there were other people like me, and I wanted to find them, and I wanted to hear their stories and how they navigated a system that really wasn't built for them, like what they had to do. And also, Dr. Fuller, because in the movies, the movie normally ends at graduation. It's like, oh, we sent him off to college and he's graduating and it's good. And what my book did, I wanted to follow the stories beyond graduation, beyond success. And for these Black men that had got a lot of success academically and professionally, like they still had to deal with the residue of that journey and of that struggle. And, you know, and I summed it up by calling it the Black Achievement Trauma Tax. And basically it was just for them to get what is promised to the country as part of this American dream. There's so much baggage and emotional baggage that comes along with it. And I just wanted to talk about it. And you know, when I did my defense, man, one of the people defending, like I came up under Sean Jenwright, who knows you, and his chair is Pedro Negura. So I guess that makes him my, I don't know, dissertation, educational grandfather or whatever. But when I was defending, man, one of them got like misty eyed, right? Because they had never seen it placed like that, and they just were reflecting on all the stuff that they've had to deal with and push down, and that book helped them to open that door. So that's why I'm glad I did that research project.
Yeah, I'm glad you did it too. I mean, my second question, because I know you're gonna ask me a question, but
go ahead, brother. I'll come after that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to come back to the Black Academic Trauma Tax. Because that was one of the things that I highlighted, and I wanted to get into a little bit deeper a discussion about what you meant by that, right? And sort of, you know, what you know, because I wanted the people who read it or who haven't read it to understand that particular concept.
Yeah, I mean, you want me to do it now? I can.
It's up to you, man.
I can do it now because I think so. For me, and you know, the Black Achievement Trauma Tax is just basically, it is we celebrated these young men for getting all the way through and becoming doctors and lawyers and doing like this amazing stuff and living this good life. But the tax that they paid socially, emotionally was so deep. It was like each of these brothers was on the verge of almost losing their wife, almost losing their family. You know, just the sacrifices that come with it because of the level of discipline it took. I'll tell you a story, Dr. Fuller. I don't know if I've said it out loud in public before. I've said it to a few friends. I went to the Bahamas a few years ago, and I was surrounded by these beautiful people, man. And the water was so clear, and there was all these Black people and food, and I was like on vacation. And then all of a sudden, man, every mistake I ever made in my life hit me at once, like on this boat. And it took me out, man. I was down for like 2 days in the Bahamas. Like I had to get myself out of bed, out of the condo. And part of that was, you know, the body, both you and I are athletes. You were a much more accomplished one than me, but you know, the body likes to heal itself. So, you know, like sometimes you just got to rest, elevate so your body can do what it needs to do. Well, your brain is the same. I spent so much time hustling and struggling to just be able to pay bills, to pay for food, make sure I can go to school, make sure I wasn't homeless, all that stuff. And now when I'm like able to buy whatever I needed and I'm on vacation, I'm not penny pitching, my brain was like, oh, we're good. Our initial survival is taken care of. So now let's go and fix all that other stuff that you had to do and all the things you've seen and the crack pipes and like people shot and people bleeding out or the sacrifices you made, right? And like it felt like I had to deal with that all at once. So when I listened to these brothers telling their story, the through line was something very similar for each of them. It was they never had the ability to heal along the way. They just kept pushing it down. But at some point, dormant trauma doesn't go away. It's just dormant. And it will it will realize itself, right? And maybe in a way that makes you be toxic or makes you sabotage your marriage or your family or whatever, right? It's like that Dave Chappelle skit from a long time ago when keeping it real goes wrong. And so that's how I kind of felt it and saw it. So hopefully that made sense. I didn't want to make it about me, but I wanted to give an example. And I'm sure if I pressed you, there might be examples in your own life around what sacrifices came and you just getting to where you are right now.
Yeah, I mean, I just appreciate the fact that you put a label on it, because any Black person, Black man, woman, who's still alive, can talk about elements of how that particular concept have impacted him, and it's a huge cost. I did want to recognize that Vaughn Glapion is on this call. I mean, is his name is Vaughn Glapion. He said Vaughn. I think he down in New Orleans, right? He's from New Orleans, but he was one of the students that participated in taking over the administration building at Duke University 50 years ago, man.
Oh man.
Yeah, and so he knows, TJ, he knows what I'm talking about, and so I just saw his name pop up there, and just wanted to shout him out, and happy to see him and stuff. So yeah, I just wanted to get that in before you got your question.
Well, no, I appreciate that, man, and that leads me to it's so much stuff that you did in this book, man. I would have 80 questions, so I had to get it down to something manageable. But let's start with the big guns. Well, one of the big guns, Mozambique. Mozambique plays a major part in your life. Can you tell me why were you in Mozambique and what happened when you were there?
Yeah, so let me try to keep this story as brief as I possibly can. But so what had happened was that I was on the board of an organization called the Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization, and it still exists today. And in fact, the daughter of Lucius Walker, who founded it, is running that organization right now. It's called the Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization. But I was on the board. And back during that period, in 1971, South Africa had a program where they were trying to invite Black people, famous Black people, to come from the United States to try to convince them that apartheid wasn't so bad. And so they were reaching out to Muhammad Ali. They were reaching out to all, and Voister was the prime minister then, to bring them over to South Africa and show them around and all this, right? So Lucas
North Korea does those type of tours now, I think.
Yeah.
It's from across the world, right?
Yeah, so I don't know, maybe that's how Rodman got over there. I don't know. But anyway, so Lucius Walker, who was the head of IFCO, he got an invitation to come, right? I was like, hell no. So I led a thing on the board to say, not only are you not going, but we're going to set up a liberation fund to support the liberation struggles that were going on at that time in Africa, in particular Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau. Those were the three main struggles that were going on at that point in time, where there were actual armed struggles. And so, and I said, not only are we, and we also going to call a press conference at the United Nations to denounce the United States, South Africa, and Israel as the Iron Triangle that's oppressing Black people in Southern Africa. So, and then we're going to set up this liberation fund. So what happened was there was a group of ministers who were going over to Tanzania, and they invited me to come to give a speech on Black education. And so when I got to Dar es Salaam, because people knew about my efforts on behalf of the liberation movements, all of the heads of the liberation movements who had offices in Dar es Salaam met with me. And one of the movements that met with me was Frelimo, the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique. And there were two brothers, Robert Fletcher and Bob Van Lierop, who were over there to go into Mozambique to do a film on the struggle that was going on in Mozambique. And there was a dude from Algeria named Boubacar, I forgot his last name, Ali or something. He was supposed to come, but for some reason he couldn't come. So when I met with the people from Frelimo, they said, hey man, like, Boubacar can't come. Do you want to take his place? And I was like, of course, right? I had no idea I was going to be doing that. So if you look at the book, you see the shoes I had on where I walked out of all that. But anyway, so the problem, of course, Charles, was I couldn't tell nobody that I was going to do this. So at one point, I'm with a group of people. I've given the speech and all of that. And then, all of a sudden, man, I just dropped off the face of the earth. I think I told Ron Daniels. But so that next day they came and picked me up, and I talk about how we traveled, and then we got to the Rovuma River, which separated Mozambique from Tanzania. You could stand in Tanzania and look across the Rovuma River and see Mozambique. And so the idea was I was going to spend 2 weeks with a guerrilla column in Mozambique. And so, I'm like, hey man, yeah, let's go. So we cross over. We used to get up like early in the morning, man, and walk. And we used to walk in elephant grass because the planes were overhead looking for us. And so we would march all day, man, and to move from place to place inside of Mozambique. And so I talk about how we were in this base camp. It was a Saturday. I never will forget it, man. And so Cornelio was my interpreter. He always was with me because people spoke all kinds of different languages, right? And he could speak English. So I had 2 people that were with me all the time, Cornelio and Fernando. Fernando was my bodyguard. And if you look at my book, there's a picture of me and him sitting together by a hut, in Mozambique. Anyway, this day, man, I'm down by the river. It was in the morning. I never will forget it, man. I'm down by the river. And all of a sudden, Cornelio started screaming Owusu, because they didn't know me as Howard Fuller. They just knew me by my African name. You got to go, you got to go. And I was like, what's going on? What's going on? And at that time, the helicopter swooped in on us, man. And they started shooting machine gun fire. You know how you see it in the movies and you run in and that machine gun fire is going ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. That was what was happening, right? And we were running trying to find some cover. And so we went into this banana plantation. It was all banana trees, man. And so, I was hugging this banana tree, trying to be a banana tree. But you could look up and you could see the helicopters and you could see the Portuguese soldiers in the helicopters. There was maybe 6 to 8 of them fully armed, and they were looking for us, man. And while we were pinned down, the bombers came in. And then while the bombers were in, the troops would land to encircle us, man. So we had a break out of the encirclement. We went up into the mountains. And that day, man, I remember, Charles, it started pouring down rain, man. We were just sitting up there, man. I thought I was going to die, that nobody would ever know anything, because nobody knew I was in there. And it was pouring down rain. So me and Van Lierop and Fletcher, we just sat there, man. And the way we got through the day was we chose, who is your top NBA player under 6 feet? Who's your top NBA player who shoot left-handed? Who, this was, and then to top it all off, man, we could get Radio South Africa, and they were reporting that we had been captured and killed, that they found us and that they killed all of us and captured. And you listened to that on the radio. And what was also happening at that moment in time, Charles, was Attica. And so the way that Radio South Africa was reporting Attica, it was like a revolution was going on in the United States, man. And so all of this was going on, right? So what happened was I was supposed to have been in there 2 weeks, but because of the attack, I ended up being in there for 31 days because it took 2 weeks to walk out. Once we got over the attack and all of that. And so then all of a sudden I reappeared after 31 days, man. My family, everybody thought I was dead. Nobody know what, what had happened to me. And yeah, so it was
that's a crazy story. Like it's like I remember reading it and being like, wait, what? I was like, what book am I reading? Like, what? I thought this was about ed reform. What the hell? Like this dude is getting shots busted at him over in Africa. And Mr. Glapion, he responded and said they were back in Durham and were out of touch with you while you were in East Africa, and the entire group was worried about you for the whole time. So so basically, who told you that you couldn't say anything?
Frelimo.
Got it.
So they said, if you're gonna go in here with us, you can't say anything. And the other thing is, they wouldn't let me carry a gun and a rifle. And the reason was, they said that if something happened, they didn't want the Portuguese to say that there were American mercenaries.
Got it.
Coming into Mozambique to help with the struggle. So that was that was the way it was. Yeah.
And before we get back to my book, I want to stay here a little bit because you touched on one of my next questions. And you just said it real quick, man, but it needs a little bit more time. Owusu, man, introduce us to Owusu and how you got that name.
Yeah. So when we created Malcolm X Liberation University back in 1969, and then we, as Vaughn knows and others, we moved to Greensboro in 1970. What we used to do, man, was on New Year's Eve, instead of going out and drinking and all of that, what we used to do was have a community festival. And a part of the community festival was to talk about the work you had done for our people during that year and what work were you going to do the following year. But what we also did was to have African naming ceremonies. Mm. And so the students picked out my name. It's really Owusu Sadaukai. It's Sadaukai. There's an A before the I. And what Owusu means is one who clears the way for others. And Sadaukai means one who gathers strength from his ancestors to lead his people. So the students gave me that name. So it's Sadaukai, but it's pronounced Sadaukai. And so the students gave me that name. And for a long time, I never used Howard Fuller at all. I mean, I didn't. And so there are people in the world who's still alive who know me. They would not know if you said Howard Fuller, they wouldn't know who you're talking about.
Dude, what is your life? And I haven't even gotten to my favorite part yet. What is your life, man? It's hard to go back to my book after you say some stuff like this, man. But go ahead.
But what's interesting is that when I tried to get my FBI file, although I got it, but you really couldn't get much out of it because the vast majority of it was redacted. But I had to request in both names in order to to get my FBI file, which was
so crazy. That is just crazy. It's geez, man. Okay, well, what is your question for me?
Okay,
I don't know how I'd be even how do we follow that up? Go ahead.
Well, we followed up with me asking you a question about this. That's how we do it. So what I was interested in was, what was the common thread that you identified between the three Black men that you put up?
I had a lot of people, and I had to, you've done a dissertation before, and I had a really good chair to make sure everything stayed really scientific, right? But we just had all these factors, and basically in the factors, I found, the young folks that had, they just had to fit this really kind of crazy profile. And I landed on these three. And so one of the things that I saw amongst all of them was there was a few things, man. One, it was the role that their mothers played in their lives, which was really interesting. And it really broke it down. Actually, they had very similar roles as far as the mother and their fathers. Their mothers just made waves, man. Like these women, that didn't know anything about navigating our education system, and one of them was immigrant, and her story was very interesting to me, just around how she saw the United States. But all of these moms really saw a future that their kids couldn't see, and like nothing stopped them. Nothing stopped them, and they all exercised like parent choice at some point. Like at some point, even if the school was better or not, their mothers were like, "I'm pulling you out of here and I'm putting you over here." And they did that early and often, and I think that actually played a big role. The other thing, man, was kind of this pent up issue between the boys and their father figures. Sometimes it was their actual father, sometimes it was their stepfather, but the relationships, it was very complicated, right? It's easy to do like a one-line write-off and just say their dads were absent or they didn't get along. And no, it was some very complicated emotions and pieces there. And I don't know if you remember the story of the boy from Richmond, and he talked about his father, and he was told that his father had died, but his dad was actually in prison for murder, and then got out, re-met his father, and then his father died from AIDS. And just, you know, all these boys had lost their fathers in like these kind of grand fashions, and just how that fueled them, right? And it was just very interesting because, you know, when I did this, Dr. Fuller, you got to use pseudonyms to change the names in the study. I used 3 of my actual friends and family members as the names because I wanted to actually highlight their stories. These boys, all 6 and 7, if you ask me, we all grew up pretty similar, especially growing up in the crack epidemic, in cities that had access to crack, and just seeing really quickly how neighborhoods went from being normal neighborhoods to like almost overnight just infested. And then it was just gone, right? Like, and so that was the other stream that everybody had, was how crack impacted their lives either directly or just like in the community, right? And so you got these moms trying to cocoon their kids from like what's going on. And these mothers made really, really tough young men, you know, and sorry, it was hard, man, because these stories were so great. And I much rather deal with my own story because I can, you know, like, I just found myself apologizing to these brothers the whole time because it was stuff I wanted to put in, but it wasn't answering the question, right? But the stories were so crazy, man. So, but there was just this one story, man, around, like, these people just told me some really personal stuff, right? And it was just hard to kind of decipher. So the through line is they have suffered a great deal of pain, a great deal of agony very early on in life. And the world didn't see them as 7-year-olds or 12-year-olds or 14-year-olds, right? In every situation, they were seen as older than what they were. And it just was a microcosm of, I think, of what happens to our kids in these systems today. And you almost got to be Herculean to have their type of stories. So those are just some of the through lines that I saw in all 3, was like similar parent dynamics, even though there were some different nuances, the crack epidemic, and then just how these kids had to deal with this extreme level of stress and trauma, like that they were living in constantly, and how they navigated through that.
Yeah, so the 3 men were DeMarcus, Donald, and Antoine. And I do have some specific questions about them after some other questions that I have for you. You know,
Okay.
we may not get to it, but okay. So I just want to make sure I got those common threads.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah. And wherever else you need to go, man, with that question, you know, we can just stay on it. You can tack it on because I think you have more questions than I did.
Yeah, so let me ask you this one, because I think this is like really like an important one, man. Well, they're all important, but you know, when I heard your speech, when I watched your speech, the one that you gave to the, I think we were in Charlotte somewhere. I can't remember exactly.
Title I in Atlanta, the Title I conference.
Title I, yeah. And so one of the points you made, and you made it in your book, and I went back to review it some last night. Not your book, your dissertation, which you turned into,
right?
Whatever. I want you to talk some about your definition of grit, and how you uh, uh, look at that concept in terms of how it is used by educators today. Because in fact, you make what some people would say is the controversial statement that there's a lack of relationship between grit and academic achievement. That's what you said, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I want you to, because I didn't, remember I sent you a note about your speech.
Yeah, and you wanted me to go deeper into the grit part.
Yeah, because I think you need to go deeper into that.
Yeah, so basically, so grit, just the way that it's like that Angela Duckworth, I mean, there's a super long definition, but the way that she just has it popularized is that it's basically, I'm just gonna read what she said. What she said was grit is defined as perseverance and passion for long-term goals. But it's actually situated in a suite of a variety of things, right? And when you utilize it in that full suite, which is like a much more responsible socio-ethical way of actually deploying this term, I don't feel as strongly about that. What I was having more of an issue was white educators in schools that were flippantly using a part of this without the other pieces. So I've seen it. I get to visit schools all over the country, and it was basically, I did have an inherent issue with white educators that's not from the culture of the young people that they're working with, talking to these kids about grit, right? When I just explained to you what these three kids are kind of going through. Now, talking to them in the context of all these other things, like, look, this is how you delay gratification, but this is also how you take care of yourself in doing those things. This is how, you identify what's needed in your life. I call that agency. I think that when you deploy agency in the appropriate way, it has those elements of grit that works. But Dr. Fuller, I've seen white people say like black kids weren't gritty, right? And it just doesn't jive. It just didn't jive with me. So, I mean, there's probably, I would have let that, I didn't have that much time at the talk in Atlanta, and I probably should have went into it a little bit more. But I just knew that I had Title I people in the room, and they was never gonna get that type of talk. It was funny when I got booked, and Michael Eric Dyson got booked. I said, well, let me hurry up and sign this contract before the union like nixes me being able to go and speak there, right? Because it's a very union heavy like presence at the police, right? So I just want the opportunity to talk about us being able to have schools that work for us and parents being the best people to make that choice. So yeah, sorry, not to be super long-winded around my grit.
No, it wasn't. Yeah, it's interesting. I never told you, but years ago I spoke at that same Title I conference.
Oh, really?
Yeah, right. They never invited me back again either. But you, in giving a response that you just gave, you went into what was going to be my next question, and that had to do with you expanding on the concept of agency, because people use that term a lot.
Right.
And I think it would be helpful for you to talk about that.
Yeah, man. So I'm gonna just be very clear from me. There's a technical definition that's in the book, man. Agency is you knowing what you need for yourself or your family and knowing how to get that the best way you can, and not necessarily waiting on the system to provide it, right? So I want to be very clear, because sometimes when I say that, people think that I'm saying don't push on the system. No. Push the system. Always push the system and try to improve it. But I'm also concerned with what's happening to kids on Monday morning. What's happening to families on Monday morning, right? So famous rapper, I quote rap lyrics a lot, the same way you quote great people who have mastered the art of writing. But 50 Cent said, hey man, you don't need a fish, you need a pole. And I've always appreciated people that gave me the pole and not the fish. So when I talk about agency, I'm saying, teach me how to go catch these fish on my own. So my desire to eat and hunger isn't relying on Dr. Fuller. You know what I mean? And what I've seen a lot, and I've worked in youth development, I've worked in social work, I've worked in healthcare. And there's a lot of people that do this, and I don't think they understand they do it. they're not teaching people how to be independent, agentic beings. They're teaching people how to be fully dependent on them because it makes them feel good. And every time I've worked with a family or a student, I start off the talk by saying, listen, I'm gonna be honest with you. Don't expect me to be with you forever. Like, there will come a time where I'm not here. Like, I want you to not need me, right? So let me prepare you for that. So when I talk about agency, that's what I'm talking about. And when I talk about agency for Black people, that is us being able to look at these numbers and say only 3 out of 10 of our Black boys can read. And it tends to happen at these type of schools. And then that group of parents pushing on that system, while they might also be having a meeting and saying, well, the 10 of us are leaving this school and we going somewhere else and we're going to do it differently. It's just basically being able to pull the tools that you need without having to be dependent, especially on the system that we see over and over and over again that's not built for us.
Thank you for that. So, hey Charles, that name is SADAU.
SADAU. All right. I'm gonna fix it. I got that off of Google, so I'm gonna fix it. Yeah. Google got me messed up, but
right.
So hopefully that answered your question. But and that's what I'm talking about. Like, I don't want, because people try to twist it, right? And when they want to come at me and they'll say, well, he don't care about the system or he a shield or whatever. It's like, nah, I worked in the system. Like, I love Oakland Unified School District. I went to school there, but I hate that 3 out of 10 Black kids ain't getting what they need. I mean, that only 3 out of 10 are reading on grade level in some schools, and in some schools it's less. And and we just can't fall in love with these systems, man. Like, I hear people in my city, man, talking about you gotta be loyal to the system, or you gotta basically declare your love for the unions of the system. Like, no, man. Children are supposed to be centered in this. And if children are centered in this, then we having a different conversation. And I'm going to shut up, but Dr. Brian Stanley, who was on my committee and a good friend and worked at the Oakland Ed Fund, he said something to me early on when I was early in this struggle and frustrated. He said, Charles, don't forget, school systems, districts, tend to be the either 1, 2, or 3 top job provider in that city. It's not just managing, it's not just about the A's and B's, right? It's about leading an economic structure. And people will talk about kids all out in the public and all that stuff, but it really comes down to being a jobs program at times. And when you forget that part, you can easily forget it. And I just like to ask you, you were a social worker, you were a superintendent over a mid-sized district, over a pretty large district. How do you feel about that statement that, a lot of people aren't aware of just the financial, powerhouse that you're actually presiding over?
Yeah, I speak all the time that he's exactly right. A school district is as much of an economic enterprise as it is an educational enterprise. And so if you read the book, it's called The Color of School Reform by Jeffrey Hennick and a number of his colleagues. The reason why the book is interesting is that it gets into this question of how is it that Black children continue not to learn in a system that is controlled by Black people. And so one of the things you begin to understand is that for a lot of Black people, school districts were the entree to the middle class. Mm-hmm. And so when you begin to talk about radically changing a school district, you're talking about impacting people's ability to pay their mortgage, their house note, and et cetera. And for all of the talk, man, about education, when I was superintendent, man, I signed contracts where people got millions of dollars, man, for roofs, school construction, textbooks, pencils. You just go down the list, right? And you see how this economic entity works. Right. And when you begin to talk about, hey man, what about the kids? There are people who work inside of districts who care about kids, but it is also their livelihood, man. And so you gotta I used to tell people all the time, man, I'm not asking y'all to take a vow of poverty. I mean, if we create charter schools, if we create private schools that are run by us, that's an alternative economic structure, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't present to people, man, like I want to make change, but in making the change, they now gonna be out on the street because they ain't got a house or they ain't got food. That's not a reasonable approach to how it is you're gonna try to bring about change.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that book was like illuminating to me because it talked about Atlanta, Detroit, DC, Baltimore, I think, and one other school district that at that point in time, the majority of the board was Black.
Mm.
And see what it also is, and I don't mean no disrespect to anybody, but it's also a discussion about colonialism and neocolonialism, right? Because a lot of us make the assumption that if you just put Black people where white people, put Black faces in what used to be high white places, that by definition is changed. No, it ain't. Because, neocolonialism is in some ways more destructive to the Black human spirit than colonialism is. Because what neocolonialism does, it puts Black people in front of you. And for a lot of Black people, you assume that if a Black person is in that position, they're going to treat Black people differently. But if you got Negro teachers, man, who are telling our children, my check going to come whether you learn or not. I got mine, you got to get yours.
Heard that multiple times in my life.
Of course you have.
Raise your hand out there if you're listening. If you heard a teacher say to you, I got mine, you better get yours.
Yeah,
I get paid whether you listen or not.
Yeah, because one of the things that Malcolm did or said was that one of the worst things that white people did to us was to teach us to hate ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you got a self-hating, bougie Negro teaching our children, and what they're doing is displacing that hatred that they have of themselves out onto our children, tell me how destructive that is in this scenario, right? And so all of us who work in these institutions, and I was the superintendent of one, every day, man, you have to ask yourself, how is the decision that I'm getting ready to make going to impact the people that this structure is supposed to be helping? Mm-hmm. And so it's for me at least, it was a constant. Are you sacrificing principle, or is it a strategy and tactic question? And I think if you decide to engage in struggle, going back to that contradiction thing that I raised, I think that's going to always be a constant thing that's in front of you.
I mean, I'm glad that our books collectively have given us the opportunity to even veer off into this with what's happening today, is because, I look for silver linings and things. And if there's a silver lining in all this stuff happening with COVID and with these uprisings and everything, it's that people are finally being able to say, I'm tired of this system and we can actually do something about it. I'm telling you, if the defunding of police happens, I need educators ready to go. And what I mean by that is now you can start calling your school union, your teachers unions to the carpet. Now you can start looking. Listen, man, when you talked about that neo-colonialism, I'll even go outside of this and outside of education and what we were talking about. My parents, right, when the housing crisis happened, right, it was a young Black man that came to my parents and sold them the house that they wouldn't be able to afford, right? They didn't understand what the ARM was, the adjustable rate mortgage or whatnot. And for my parents who had gotten clean and fixed up their credit and did all this stuff, right? They thought it was just a blessing from God, right? Like, I'm like, Mom, I don't think that don't really make sense, right? Like, but she like, no, we've been faithful. We've been doing this. And it's this young Black man that's like walking us through it. He said there's some things that's confusing, but he gonna take care of it for us, right? And then, a year later, that dude was gone. That rate changed, and then they lost their house like a whole bunch of other people lost their house, right? So when you talk about that example of putting the right people in front of you to sell you a bill of goods, it's not just happening in the police and in these government pieces or whatever the case is. It gets used in every aspect of our lives. So what do you want us to, what's the step you want us to take in the education world now that we see that it's possible to defund something as big and powerful like the police unions?
Well, but first of all, we ain't seen that yet, Charles.
Well, that's true. That's true.
I mean, let's be clear.
Milwaukee, they just went back on their word. I think they actually they agreed to do it, and then when they got pressed, they were like, "Well,
yeah, right." And again, it isn't so much the question. It is the question of defunding, but it's the broader question of if you're going to protect the public. And the public does need protection, right? Let's be clear about that. The issue is, what is the best form? What is the best way to do that? It's the same thing we ask in education. We want our children to be educated, but the question is, what is the best way to do that? Mm-hmm. And the assumption that we keep making is the best way to do that is if you read Tayek's book, The One Best System, we keep coming back to the best way to do that is the one best system. We're doing the same thing with the police, is that we're saying the only way to protect the people is to have a police structure as it currently exists. Just like we have to go back and understand that the education system is what we learned from Prussia, we have to go back and understand how did the police begin? Because what you're talking about is not the absence of protection of citizens. You're talking about the form, the institutional arrangement that got created to protect citizens. And you're seeing that it's doing the opposite. But again, Charles, I would say to everybody, if you ever going to consider fundamental change, whether it's in a macro level or micro level, right? You still have to, you have to start with what is the philosophical foundation for this entity? Like this brother who's the head of the Ford Foundation, man. He was talking about the need to make changes in capitalism. He's sitting on $13 billion, man, as the head of the Ford Foundation. And he was making an argument that was actually a good argument that the system has built in economic inequality, right? And so his argument was, we're gonna have to change something about the nature of capitalism in order for there to be equity. I'm looking forward to the person who's the head of the Ford Foundation leading the struggle to significantly change capitalism. I'm just saying, once you make that statement, I'm looking for the white people that's going to come out of the Ford Foundation that map out the strategy to change economic inequality that is the essence of the political economic system that we live in. I'm looking forward to that discussion.
I mean, that's wild, man. I mean, listen, like but I think a lot of stuff is performative though, Dr. Fuller. I think a lot of people are performing. I think that there are people that's in position, black, white, and otherwise. And they know that people have short attention spans. And if I can, go in the middle of Washington and take a knee with kente cloth on and all this stuff, like just get the damn bill passed. Like did you see Nancy Pelosi and everybody else yesterday? And I wrote something about it. I just was like, look, if you really mess with black people, you don't have to perform in that type of way. I still need to get Trump out here, and I can do two things at once, like you said about Joe. But the pandering was on 1,000, and I think that's what was happening. It's lawnmowers and stuff outside, but that's what was happening. They always pander, man. And I think the Ford Foundation, the brother was pandering, right? Like, because it's like nobody's going to just write their demise. Like, that's just not how power works. That's not a good model to retain power. And they're really good at it because they've done it for hundreds of years. So one more question for you, man. And we can go as long as you want. But there was this very special day and that you talk about in your book. that means a lot to me. And I have just gotten to a place where I just call it the Corey Methodist Church Day, the very special day. Can you tell me, tell the people what happened at Corey Methodist Church on this faithful day, where you just being a young man early in this, a baby in the struggle yourself, you got to experience a once in a lifetime event.
Yeah. So what happened was I was in graduate school in Cleveland, Ohio, and this dude Louis Lomax going after the Nation of Islam. And I wish I could remember the name of it because I actually read it. I don't remember the name of it. And so there was a debate scheduled between Louis Lomax and Malcolm X. And it was at Corey Methodist Church. It was either April 3rd or April 5th or April 4th. It was one of those 3 days in 1964. And so, like a whole lot of Black people, I'm just going to tell the truth, man. I was scared of Malcolm, man, because all I saw, man, was what these white people were saying about him on TV, man. I was like, oh my God, who is this dude, man? So I said, I gotta go listen to him, man. And so I went to Corey Methodist Church, man. The church was packed, Charles. It was like, and I was sitting up in the balcony, in the first row of the balcony, and I had a straight shot looking at Malcolm. And if you read the ballot, because that's where he gave the ballot or the bullet speech.
Mm-hmm.
And if you read it, he starts out by saying, Brother Lomax. And a lot of people thought that was the minister of the church or something. No, it was Louis Lomax, because it was a debate between Malcolm and Louis Lomax. And so Malcolm laid out this ballot or the bullet speech, man. Charles, man, I'm telling you, one of the reasons that I always pay a lot of attention, when somebody asks me to come speak, I really understand the importance of putting my heart and stuff into it, right? Because a speech can change a person's life. And the reason why I know that is because that speech changed my life. And so that I walked into that church as one kind of Negro, and I walked out an entirely different, my whole mind changed, man. It was just, Charles, you had to hear the power of Malcolm, man. It was just the way he broke it down, man. It was so logical and powerful, man. You couldn't, you know, if you had a half a brain, man, you could not sit there and just like, oh, that ain't true. You know, he was, oh man, Malcolm was just like.
I mean, how was Lomax during the talk? Did you get a chance to see his demeanor?
You know what? I don't remember a lot about Lomax. I don't even know if I'm sure he spoke. Mm-hmm. I don't remember.
I'm sure he was there. I'm sure
yeah, he definitely spoke, but you ain't never seen no Louis Lomax speak to the masses, right? Mm-hmm. All you ever hear about is ballot or the bullet speech, because it was so powerful, man. And Malcolm just had this way of speaking. And see, the interesting thing was that afternoon, I forgot to put this part in there. In the afternoon, they had a debate, but it was in front of social workers and people who could take off and be there in the afternoon. That night, Corey Methodist Church was packed with working class and low income Black people, man. And they weren't feeling Lomax, man. You could just feel, man, like the connection that Malcolm was making, man. And he was so powerful. I was sitting there, man, I was like mesmerized, man, by Malcolm. And then, as you know, when we formed Malcolm X Liberation University, and there's a video of this actually, Betty Shabazz, and I know my daughter is listening to it because she was there. She was little then, but Betty Shabazz came to the opening of Malcolm X Liberation University.
Wow.
And spoke. And we got a part of that speech on video, and it's actually in the Smithsonian. Wow. It's in the museum, the opening of Malcolm X Liberation University.
Yeah, man, it's so many stories in that book. It's so much, and I would definitely suggest anybody that can definitely go pick that up. No Struggle, No Progress. It was just amazing, man. I don't know if there's anything else you want to ask about mine or whatnot, but the folks came to hear about your book, Dr. Fuller. But
they came to hear about our book.
But this is true. This is true. We should just write one together and just call it a day. But what other thoughts did you have about mine? It's just, dude, I be coming back. It's like, okay, Mozambique, and then we come back to my book. Malcolm X, and then we come back. I should have just went first. And just focus on yours, but let's go back to mine.
I wanted you to talk a little bit about why you chose that particular research design, because whenever you get ready to do your dissertation, right, you can, as people know, you can choose a number of different. You can choose qualitative, you can choose quantitative. They give you all of these different research methodologies that you can choose, and what you chose, if I correct, is the oral history kind of design, right? Mm-hmm. So and then you still, of course, have to answer. You have to pose your research questions. Yeah, and you can go at those research questions with different designs. So why did you choose the particular design that you chose?
That's such a good question, and it's such a personal answer. So that was actually a really good question. One, I wanted my research to be accessible to my people. I fought with the university and the academy around who my audience was. I said, I don't want to write to white researchers. I want to write to Black moms. So what we were able to do, and what we were able to do with the love of my chair was every time we got a chapter approved, I took it to a group of Black moms, and whatever they didn't understand or they couldn't follow, I changed, I altered, or I took it out, because if they couldn't use it, what's the point? I landed on oral histories because I wanted the most Afrocentric way that kind of talked about, Africans that were born here in America, Africans that were born on the continent, and just the ways in which we've always shared our history. And it's always been through, oral historians and griots and folks like that. And so, once I found that I can do that in a scientific way and design a good study around it, I wanted to just recapture the art of storytelling, because the best speakers that I've ever seen in my life, like, they tell you a story, right? Like they're like people like today, you just told a collection of stories, and stories just hang with you differently, man. They speak to your heart, and they see beyond just the things that's there. The other reason with that too, and I said this in the talk, and for anybody listening, we need more Black researchers. I don't care if you're going to get a doctorate or whatever, but I do think learning how to research and report on things is really important, because this is where representation is important. There's a part in the book that scared a lot of people, and it was a lot of non-Black people that had a lot of judgment for this mom, but it was when basically one of the boys got beat up, their brother got beat up, and the mom said, "You're going to go back outside and fight. You're not going to come in here crying. Fight them, or you're going to fight me." And there were some colleagues that looked at that were from outside of my culture and thought that she should have been arrested. Like, they were so, man, they were so offended, right, by that notion. And I said, nah, man, you don't understand. They were in DP Stokeland in the 90s, man. Like, if that boy came home and they saw that he could get picked on, he would get messed with every single day. And what she was doing was she was teaching him how to survive in the time and in the place where they were. And it kind of reminds me of when you told the story of your grandmother and your mother and the cop. It's like, that's just how you was raised. You was raised. And if somebody else would have had that outside of our culture, they would have demonized that woman, right? As opposed to actually seeing the strength and the sacrifice and teaching her kid how to survive in that space. So that's why I chose oral history, because it tied to our African heritage. It was stories that I could relate to people that I care about. And 3, it allowed for the nuance of who we are and culturally how we've been misrepresented in the past. It allowed me to actually right some of those wrongs.
Yeah, I think what's significant though, Charles, is and maybe we need to close out here and come back, because there's still a lot to talk about. It's also important that when we talk about our culture, for example, I don't know how many people out there know about Sekou Touré. Sekou Touré was the president of Guinea. And I had lunch with Sekou Touré when I was in Guinea. And Sekou Touré wrote a book about culture. An article about culture. But but because he used dialectical materialism as a way to think, he was talking about the dialectical relationship between like theory and practice, but also this whole thing about how culture. How do I describe this? That if a culture doesn't change, it dies.
Mm-hmm.
And so so what happened is, once we were brought to America, taken away from Africa, what you would call an African American culture is not the same as a peasant, in Africa, because the objective dynamics of your life influences culture, because culture is how you think, how you act, how you behave, and all of that, right? That is influenced by the material basis of your existence. So that when you begin to talk about culture for Black people, you can't talk about culture in the absence of talking about class. Because to a certain extent, something that you might define as a Black culture,
right,
may be a mixture of your race and your economic circumstance.
Right. Absolutely. Right? Absolutely.
Right. Because
absolutely.
If you grew up in the projects, you got one set of dynamics you got to deal with, versus if you grew up somewhere, and I'm just saying, if you grew up in a really nice place in the suburbs and this or that, I'm not
there's no judgment pass. It's just different.
I'm just saying it's different, right? And so the set of circumstances you got to deal with every day when you go to school,
right,
or come home from school, they different.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about culture, Black culture, it's important that we talk about the class dynamic. It's just like with this COVID-19, when Shannon and I were writing that article about we not all in this in the same way. We're not all experiencing this pandemic in the same way, right? Because you and me, like, we blessed, man. We got food, shelter, clothing, and some money, and a Zoom account. And so, but many of our people don't have any of that.
Right.
Which is why, if we're going to identify with our people, we have to identify with our people, beginning with identification with the pain that our people are dealing with, right? Or else it becomes an intellectual abstraction, right? And we, those of us who are in the situation that we're in, have to work hard not to get separated from the real pain of our people. Because when you start operating outside of that pain, you are much more likely to immediately accept compromises that don't impact that pain at all.
Right.
So, but anyway, so
well, I know that was great. And you actually just that's the precipice for the second book, right? And it's, some people don't like the name. Chris definitely gives me a hard time about the name, but it means a lot to me. Crack Baby Residue, and that book is set to serve exactly what it is that you're talking about. It's like, I've talked about what the residue does. Let me actually go back and examine the residue. Like, let me actually reconnect with that pain and also the joy from those times or whatever, but the things that made me. But I'm gonna need your help with that. Might be nice to have an editor this time. But at any rate, man, Dr. Fuller, this has been great. I got to just fan out this episode, this session. We can actually pick up some of this in the next one. And as we start to bring on some more of your special guests, what do you want to say to these people in closing who resonated with your words all week?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. Number one is always, man, like, be safe. Man. I mean, we had a graduation at our school, man, on Saturday, man. It was beautiful. It took 6 hours for all 52 of the 54 seniors to come up in their car, get out their car, go to the stage, but every one of them got the same love, man. And it took 6.5 hours, but it was a beautiful thing, right? But still out there, I was concerned and remain concerned about the number of people who are not taking this this COVID-19 seriously, man. I mean, in the sense of not wearing masks, not trying to practice any kind of social distancing and stuff like that. And so I just want to urge all of us, to the degree that we can, to try to stay safe out there, man. The second thing I want to say clearly is that, this struggle against the police is part of a larger struggle against depression. And that if this is going to be an inflection moment, then we need to make it an inflection moment. Mm-hmm. And we need to go radical or don't go at all. Because anything that is just a part of the appeasement strategy is a violation of the moment in history, is the way I would characterize it. And then the last thing I want to say, man, and it gives me just great pleasure to be able to say this, man. When you going to do the audio version of your dissertation, my brother?
I did it, and Amazon needed me to make some edits and stuff to it.
It took a long time. It took a long time for them to finally put mine on audiobook, man. There was all these changes.
If it takes me too long, I'm just learning these systems. I'm just gonna put it out myself, like a set of podcasts, and sell it for $4.99 or $9.99 or something. But I got it all with me, and I'm gonna go in and try to do the edits. I did all of it by myself, soup to nuts, right, with no help. So you might be able to. I know you got an editor in the company, so I might need an introduction. But I've been on this independent hype, and just it's good to help.
It's all good. I just want to hear it.
Oh yeah, man, I got you, man. I did it the last time I was out here. I did it around right before Christmas. I just locked myself away in the house and just recorded it. But every word. But man, it will be out here soon. I appreciate you so much, Dr. Fuller. I'm looking forward to next week. To make it a little easier for people, I'm going to start creating an Eventbrite so it's easier to share, things of that nature. I've just been spending more time trying to get the quality and content of our episodes great, but I know we need to do a bit more marketing and getting it out there. But as always, for Dr. Fuller, I'm Charles Cole. You have been in another session of Howard University, and we will see you next week at the same time in the same place. Peace out.
Hey, peace and power, brother.
Peace and power.
All right.
And